Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for our second panel on the war impact on Russian politics and economy. My name is Ratelle from the co-director of PONARS Eurasia. We will have really a great group of scholars here to discuss how Russian politics and economy has been impacted by the war. Let me present them very briefly. We will have first Peter Rutland from Wesleyan University discussing the Russian economy in the face of sanctions. Then a group of our colleague Volodymyr Ishchenko from Freie Universität in Berlin, Ilya Matveev from University of California, Berkeley, and Oleg Zhuravlev from the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Italy, discussing Russian military Keynesianism. Then Marat Iliyasov from Miami University of Ohio, co-authored with Jean-Francois Ratelle from University of Ottawa on Ramzan Kadyrov, and Margarita Zavadskaya from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs discussing mutiny and violence monopoly in Russia, and our discussant will be William Pomerantz from Kenan Institute. So really great group of scholars. I would like to begin by giving the floor to Peter.
Okay, so this is help, please. This is a manel, unlike the previous one, which was a womanel. This works, thank you. So I've got 8 minutes, so I'll get straight to the point and zip through at fast speed. I'll state the obvious. I think I'm stating the obvious. If I'm wrong, please tell me, because I hate the conclusions that I'm coming to today. These are very inconvenient truths, although there are some areas of uncertainty. And this cliche from Sun Tzu, know the enemy, but also know yourself, otherwise you will lose the battle and the war. One broad question is, what was the purpose of the sanctions? Ideally, they would have deterred the war in the first place. That failed. But what are the point of sanctions as the war goes on for months and years? Is it to destroy the Russian economy? Is it to effect regime change in Russia? Is it to ensure that Russia loses the war? Is it to make it more costly for Russia to engage in war so that when the peace negotiations come, they will be more amenable to compromise? And I don't think we have any clear discussion of any of these questions of what is the purpose of the sanctions, let alone the question which I'll mainly address of are they working or not. In 2022, because of the spike in energy prices, Russia more than made up for the frozen assets and was earning around $800 million a day in oil and gas exports, and spending maybe $300 million a day to fight the war. And okay, the prices have come down. Oil has come down from over 130 a barrel to around $85, $90 a barrel. But still, Russia, as one of the top 3 energy exporters in the world, is not going to run out of cash. Slight more optimism on the gas front, because Europe cutting back 80% of natural gas pipeline deliveries. That Russian gas doesn't really know where else to go. China's only taking about a fifth of what used to go to Europe, so they are going to take a hit financially on the gas front, but they're continuing to make money on the oil front. The price cap of $60 a barrel was delayed until December, and then on oil products until February. We can debate why was that. Was it connected to the November 22 midterm elections in the United States? I suspect that it was, but that gave Russia an extra year of easy money from its oil exports. Some Western oil service companies, the Schlumberger, Halliburton, continued supplying hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment to Russia throughout 2022, and some of them into the first half of 23. The oil majors did lose over $30 billion of confiscated assets in Russia, but on the global markets, they made over $100 billion in profits because of the price surge. So I'm not shedding any tears for them. Onto the sanctions. The main problem, of course, is that the sanctions are not working because they are not broad enough. Only 60% of global GDP countries are enforcing the sanctions, and that means Russia's just been able to divert trade to China, India, Turkey, and the Middle East. And okay, it's more costly for Russia to do that. They have to pay a premium, pick a number, 30% more expensive. It's still not enough to really seriously constrain their war effort. In terms of specific dual-use technologies, it seems to be just so easy for electronics and other goods, not to mention luxury automobiles, to be routed through UAE, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, etc., to keep the Russian war machine going and to keep the Russian elite buying their iPhones and what have you. On the domestic front, Russia has adapted to a war economy, and this was a long time coming. We can see in retrospect that Putin was militarizing Russian political system, society, and economy for years before this. But there has been adaptation and creativity. Russia is a capitalist society. It has a lot of people who are adept, entrepreneurial, and so we haven't seen a kind of implosion of the economy. We've seen certainly massive diversion of resources into military spending and some diminution of ordinary living standards, but nothing catastrophic that's going to promote a revolt of any sort, either by elites or by ordinary people. The technocrats continue to manage the economy fairly well after the initial panic of the run on the ruble, after the exclusion from international banking. Inflation was contained. The ruble has continued to slide, over a third loss in value this year, which has caused some policy corrections in terms of introducing export tariffs on non-oil and gas exports and reintroducing compulsory exchange of foreign earnings into rubles. That happened in September, October of this year. But other things being equal, I see the economy is fairly stable and is projected to grow. IMF says 1%. Central Bank of Russia says 2.5% this year. The budget for next year sees a tripling of military spending on the pre-2021 level. It's now up to 6% of GDP, while I would remind people that NATO is struggling to reach 2% of the NATO GDP. And budget deficit for next year is going to be estimated 1% of GDP, with an assumption of an oil price of $70 a barrel for Urals, which is about the same as what they were getting this year, and the ruble at $90 per dollar, which is about what it is now. These are some other points I mentioned. Apart from the oil exports, of course, Russia is a fairly diverse economy, and they've had 2 good years of grain harvest, and they earn about $40 billion a year from grain exports. Rosatom earns $10 billion a year, both in contracts for building atomic stations, but also in selling enriched uranium to France and the US, over $1 billion a year. Continue to spend, we and the French continue to spend on Russian uranium. Then there's diamonds, fish, timber. It's a long list of products. Now, admittedly, some sectors of Russian industry have been hit extremely hard. Auto industry has collapsed. They're buying a lot of Chinese cars these days. Aviation industry is obviously in tremendous trouble after the seizure of those hundreds of aircraft, possibly the largest single theft in human history, by billions of dollars worth of aircraft seized. Last couple of points is that the political economy of this is very depressing. One theory could have been the sanctions would cause the oligarchs to turn on Putin and kick him out so they can continue enjoying their wealth. That didn't happen, from which I conclude that Russia is a personal dictatorship, not a kleptocracy. The thieves, unfortunately, do not rule. They would have been more rational and more incentive-driven if they were in charge. On the contrary, the seizure of foreign assets has enabled the Kremlin to strengthen controls over the oligarchy by rewarding the most super loyal inner circle or favored cronies with over $40 billion worth of foreign assets. And although they took a hit in 2022, but the top 110 Russian billionaires' wealth is estimated to have risen in 2023. What next? The West will continue trying to tighten the sanctions. This famous shadow fleet of 400 or 500 crude tankers that are taking that oil to India and China. Maybe there can be some crackdown on those with very dubious insurance coverage, maybe prevent them flying from sailing through the Baltic Sea altogether. But again, adaptability is the watchword, so they'll find other ways to get that oil out, I'm afraid. The cost of sanctions on the West should also be factored in. This is not a one-way street. And as Zavadskaya said, many policies promoted by Western authorities appear to be more painful to their own economies than to Russia's. And in particular, the energy subsidies, Germany spent over 300 billion in energy subsidies, and has had still facing a recession. So these are very severe constraints on the European economies. The US has been insulated from most of that as an energy exporter. But it's not at all clear to me that Western politicians and publics, either in the US or in Europe, are ready to continue reaching deep into their pockets to keep this war going for years to come. On that, I'm done.
Thank you so much for sobering assessment. Let's now continue discussing Russian economy with our group of scholars Volodymyr, Ilya, and Oleg. Volodymyr will be presenting.
Yeah, to a large extent, our paper also continues the previous discussion about the impact of the new economic reality for the Russian perceptions of the war. So, why do Russians, or actually the majority of Russians, support the war and they continue to support the war? So these are the figures from Russia Watcher project, but other attempts to measure the Russian public opinion, which shows something pretty similar. So even if the support for the war decreased, it decreased not that significantly as people would love to expect. And there have been several competing answers to this question. Well, the most immediate answer was that these polls are not reliable for the problems like preference falsification. There have been actually attempts to measure this preference for falsification and still showing that the majority of Russians do support the war. And the surveys are still the most systematic way to measure what the majority thinks in Russia. So the next answer was that probably most Russians actually share something like that Ukrainians and Russians are not the same people and they should be subjugated. So which is like a little bit different question whether the Kremlin or the Russian elite shares this idea. A different question was actually that the majority of Russians, at least initially at the start of the invasion, they supported the war not exactly because of sharing any imperialist ideas, but basically because they didn't care. Because they were depoliticized and they basically delegated the decision to start the war to the people to whom they delegated the complicated foreign policy decisions for many years. And this was the argument of our article with Oleg Zhuravlev last year. And however, there is a different answer to this question, which may become more and more prominent as when the war creates a new economic reality for Russians. So what about if at least, not speaking about majority, but at least some significant broad groups of the Russian population start to materially benefit from the war? And this is a different answer than thinking about how the Russian oligarchs or the new Russian elite might benefit from the war, but we are speaking about the broad groups among the working class, among the subaltern classes in the Russian society. And this creates a very different kind of support, much more conscious, rational, and this creates a positive feedback loop for the capacity of the Russian state to continue waging the war in the long run. So a way to analyze this question is actually going, one of the possible ways is about the concept of military tensionism. So the state starts to spend on the military-industrial complex. This creates jobs, this increases the incomes of some broad groups of the population. This creates aggregate demand, and this creates also the capacity to, for the multiplier effects, also for the civilian sectors of the economy. And some of the classical examples of military Keynesianism are typically named as Nazi Germany and also the United States during the Cold War. And the skeptics of this concept say that the military industrial complex requires a little different kind of technology, so it may not be so easily transferable to the civilian sectors. And in fact, in certain cases, the military industry may rob the civilian sectors of the labor force, of the investment, so in certain way damaging the economic growth in the long run. So how it works in Russia? We've seen, and actually Peter's presentation showed some specific figures. So Russian economy is starting to grow this year, and the leading sectors were the finished metal products, computer electronics and optical products, which are directly or indirectly connected to the military production. This also had an impact on the recovery in real incomes of the Russians and also decreasing poverty level below the 10%. And one may doubt the Russian official statistics, but it also sounds quite plausible because they recruit the soldiers whom they pay very significant wages in relation to the average median wage in the Russian society. And so it should have the significant impact on the decrease in the poverty and the inequality in the Russian society. And furthermore, the Russian Ministry of Finance, there is evidence that they actually use this as a targeted policy, at least in 2022, 2023. They introduced the concept of fiscal impulse even before the invasion with the COVID pandemics. After the invasion, they expanded its use to include the deficit financing. And basically they state that this expansionary fiscal policy is going to strengthen national defense and also integrate the new regions, which they mean the annexed Ukrainian regions. There are also questions about how it can be sustainable in the Russian circumstances. So one problem is the technology gap, which is also exacerbated by the sanctions. And so that means that Russia may, for example, import technology, let's say from China, or make some breakthrough in research and development in the home, but which is also quite unlikely. In the long run, it may lead to the decline in product quality and also hampering the economic growth. Another is the problem that, there is a problem to borrow in foreign markets. And furthermore, the Russian Ministry of Finance, even for the next year, plans to cut the budget deficit almost twice. So that would mean that perhaps the money for the military expenditures might be taken from other sectors of the economy. Exactly the problem with education. And furthermore, perhaps the biggest problem is the labor shortage. In 1940, the United States had the rate of unemployment almost 15%. In Russia, the rate of unemployment now is 3%. So that means that actually the 60% of the companies report that they do have labor shortages. That means that the outcome would be rather the overheating of the economy, which leads to inflation, which undercuts the positive effects of the increase of wages, social spendings, and so on and so forth. And finally, how does it impact this hypothesis about changing character of support for the war? So again, this is a figure from Russia Watcher project. It shows that actually more Russians believe that they are satisfied with the general economic situation in Russia, despite the war. And to go deeper into the changing character of the support, these are preliminary results of quantitative and also qualitative study. So we participated in creating a questionnaire for the cognitive project, which one of the projects which tries to survey the attitudes of Russia in relation to the war. And again, this is preliminary analysis, but we see that there is something like a big overlap of the beneficiaries of the war, of the economic optimists who think that the Russian economy is doing better, and also active supporters, not simply who are those saying that they do support the so-called special military operation, but those who are ready to volunteer for the front line, but is going to donate some money. So to give some figure, 37% of the Russian respondents said that the military expenditures have a positive impact on the Russian economy, and among those people, only 12% say that they would not like to go to volunteer for the front line. Among those who do not believe that the war have a positive impact on the Russian economy, 50% say they are not going to volunteer. These people are mainly from the state-owned enterprises, those companies which successfully benefit from the import substitution, also from the IT, which is the department. And also we complement this with the analysis of the in-depth interview which were conducted by the Public Sociology Laboratory in the first months of the war, and then in the fall of 2022, when the impact of the new economic policies was somehow visible. And they actually see in the analysis of the narratives and how the same people are responding in spring 2022 and then in the fall 2022, how the new economic reality is impacting their support. So this is one of the examples of the quotation from hesitating beneficiary who was initially not sure about supporting the war, but he got a better job, which was connected to the import substitution. And he starts to connect the prospects of Russia as a state with the prospects of himself and the prospects of his own family. And he narrates a very strong pro-war narrative. There is also a reverse direction, when the people who initially were pretty jingoistic, and this is a quotation from a person who is in the audience of so-called vainglory, the military bloggers, but he started to feel the impact of the inflation, the prices going up, and for him the economic situation is going better. So he does not assess the Russian economic prospects optimistically, and he doesn't believe in import substitution, and his support for the war weakens. And so to sum up, we see that in the short term, the military Keynesianism in Russia have worked. However, there are big questions about whether it can be sustainable in the long run. And furthermore, the immediate impact of the new economic policies on the support for the war among Russians is actually contradictory. There are people who are starting to become indeed rational, conscious supporters because the war benefits them. But on the other hand, the military tension is under unfavorable conditions, specifically of the labor shortage, produces the groups of losers whose support for the war weakens, precisely because of the military tensionist policies. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr, for putting us in this kind of insight, giving us this insight into the grassroots impact of the war. We are now moving to the more political side with Marat discussing, comparing Chechen and Russian discourses.
Good morning, everyone. So, thank you for having me today. So, this research is a joint project with Jean-Francois Ratelle, who couldn't be present today. So, I will take the whole heat on me. And the project aims at identifying if Kadyrov's loyalty still remained unshaken towards Putin. So, to do so, why we thought that it could change actually is because Kadyrov would allow himself sometimes to talk, especially in Chechen language, a little bit freely and in support for pro-independence of Chechnya, and highly praise Dzhokhar Duda, who was the first president of de facto independent Chechnya. And to do so, we decided to analyze Kadyrov's telegram. And why we decided to focus on his telegram is because it was the easiest for us. We decided that it has 2 million subscribers, including 2 of us as well. And it's after Kadyrov was banned from other social media, it remained probably the only outlet where he can express himself. And plus, it has quite a good summary of what was going on during the day in Chechnya. And the news in Chechnya on Chechen TV is pretty much all about Kadyrov, which is expanded version of what is posted on Telegram. So, so we look at pretty much the period starting from the beginning of the war, full-scale invasion in Ukraine, February 24th up until October 16th, a couple of weeks before the conference here, and it included 2,098 posts, including voice messages, videos, and text. And regarding the methodology, we use 3 approaches here. A little bit of advertisement, so NLP, natural language processing software, which was developed in collaboration with Russian Institute of George Washington University. But software is not perfect, so we decided to also look at the textual posts on Telegram and analyze them kind of manually. So we would read the posts and decide where to and how to categorize it. And the same, and our particular focus is videos, where especially Kadyrov speaks in Chechen language, which kind of can expose his disloyalty to Putin. So preliminary research findings are, this is all based on software. So as you can see, this should be top words, and then on the other side is top phrases. So a lot of words and phrases are pretty much not about war in Ukraine, but about Chechnya, that's what software says. But in fact, it is about war in Ukraine. Like pretty much all posts somehow touch upon, probably if we calculate it manually, it would be like 80% of all posts are somehow related to war in Ukraine. At the same time, we can see that he talks about Russia, about Akhmat. In Chechnya, everything is Akhmat, Chechen Republic, and hero of Russia. And this is another schematic depiction of what software does. So you can see also the connection in between the words, the meanings of the words and meaning of the phrases. And this gives us pretty much 3 clusters, which are again all related to war in Ukraine and related to Chechnya and Akhmat. So this kind of repeats the same pattern, but based on individual words. So we have again 3 clusters, and again they are all related to war in Ukraine and Chechnya. And by relation to Chechnya, I mean it's pretty much the promotion and self-legitimation of Kadyrov himself. So these are the interrelated topics. So we have war in Ukraine. He praises Putin quite a lot, and he is, of course, promoting the way of his father that Chechnya lives in accordance with. So here in the table you can see what words are mostly used in relation to war in Ukraine, whereas the post is not just touching upon but addressed directly this cluster. So you have direction, направление, you have воин, the warrior, you have доброволец, the volunteer, etc., etc. At the down part you cannot see, but there are words that are related to some kind of religious justification, and not only religious. So let's say he uses word Satan quite a lot, so his fight is against Satanism, against Satans. He also used the term Ukronato, So, which probably suggests that Ukraine will be a member of NATO soon. So anyway, the conclusion is that all posts are aimed at self-promotion and gaining legitimacy. Further, while analyzing text of the posts, we also found that the trajectory of his speeches changed a little bit. So at the beginning of the war, he was quite confident and bragging that the war will be finished in 1 week or so, and he was just waiting for an order from Putin to finish the war. And that goes quite for a long time, and after maybe half a year, the situation changes. He starts talking already, addressing Ukrainian people and appealing to them to force Zelensky to run away and to stop the war. And there was a little bit of rebellion against Putin in September of 2022, when Putin declared the partial mobilization, and Kadyrov refused to do so, saying that Chechens already completed it. But in any case, in all the posts, one can see that his loyalty remained unshaken. He can criticize whoever but Putin. And further on, we also analyzed videos and his self-recorded videos, sometimes not self-recorded videos, in which he speaks about also political issues. He talks a lot about international relations, which is not the sphere of Russian governance at all. But he allows himself to do so, and he is engaged in propaganda, and again, with all these patterns like anti-NATO, anti-Ukraine propaganda, and mocking sanctions and everything like that, he remains still loyal to Putin. So to conclude, we think that the main idea of Kadyrov telegram and his posts, besides self-legitimation and self-promotion, is like to express his loyalty, to make sure that Putin and Kremlin knows about it. He uses the deployment of his own troops to also advertise this devotion to Putin. He tries to use it to make an effect of rally around the flag, to mobilize more Chechens for war in Ukraine, and he also uses military success of Russia to promote himself as a great strategist and tactician, and the military failures in Ukraine he uses also to try to boost his credential in order to probable future bid for federal position. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marat. And I now would like to give the floor to Margarita Zavadskaya, discussing will there be more mutiny implication of undermining violence, monopoly in Russia?
Thank you so much. Now our panel is really looking into the heart of darkness, on especially the last presentation. So I'm actually a scholar of peaceful things like social movements and surveys, but this time, together with my co-author Ilya from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, we made a preliminary analysis, so it's a very early stage research project on the implications of undermining violence monopoly in Russia. So having the Prigozhin's mutiny in mind, but this is just one of the examples. So we basically are looking at the mutiny as just kind of a manifestation of the regime's vulnerabilities. So we're basically not looking at the situation from the security studies point of view or paramilitarization point of view. We are kind of taking the gaze of scholars who used to study governance and political regime dynamics. So it's just an important disclaimer to understand where we are when it comes to kind of theoretical standpoint. Okay, how do I, yeah. How do I change? Yeah, here we go. So I try to avoid by all means possible to kind of show you any pictures because I think it's not of any aesthetic value for any of us. So this is the first and the last one. So, well, when actually the mutiny happened, I was in Tbilisi and I basically commented on mutiny on Medusa, on the podcast with Vladislav Gorin and my colleague Andrei Pertsev, and basically we were literally trying to be super cautious and saying every single word because we didn't know what actually, political science don't predict what's going to happen in the future, right? So it's not our task. But when it comes to policy analysis, our mission is slightly different. And I dared to say that I think this guy is dead, like politically, that's for sure, but perhaps also physically. And then I remember my Andrei Pertsev's face when he looked at me, are you like sure what you're saying? And you know what happened after, like literally 4 weeks after. So, I mean, I had zero doubts when I was a bit surprised why it took so long, but actually there was also some kind of political rationale behind. But that's not the main focus of my research in this project. So basically, what are the political implications of Prigozhin's rise and fall for the Russian political domestic landscape? So it's basically this kind of research is motivated by know your enemy logic. So my apologies for that, but this is where we are at the moment. And basically what we're trying to argue, Prigozhin's rebellion was not just a glitch in the system, but was rather a manifestation of structural risks within the Russian regime. And I'm trying to kind of, lay down the logic behind this argument. Here we go. So the Russian political regime is a personal dictatorship that basically relies on risk aversion. So the regime relies on depoliticized rank and file bureaucrats and army and officers with like a very kind of small share of fully controlled propagandists. And even if they actually will go out of hand, they face some consequences, as we know. And those who are particularly overzealous when it comes to showing their patriotism, they also tend to get punished. That's what happened to Strelkov or Girkin, right? Strelkov is his nom de guerre. Risk aversion is at the backbone of the regime. So both from the top and from the bottom, in the bottom. What the regime has been doing so far, it actually has putting a lot of effort in coup-proofing the regime. So, and it started well before Putin, so because Yeltsin also did some kind of a rearrangement with former KGB structures and basically split into the three structures, like internal security, FSB, external SVR, and FSO, like President's Guard, personal security. Then Putin basically continued this trend. So he established National Guard in 2016. Then now, especially after the big war started in February last year, we also faced like several endeavors to kind of further split the military or paramilitary military organizations, so apart from private military companies, right? So governors' private armies, or the introduction of volunteer units within the National Guards this year. So these are the brand new developments. And I think it's really important kind of to look at them from the governance point of view, at least in terms of like governance efficiency or effectiveness. When it comes to political regimes, so when I say like personal dictatorship, it means that this regime is extremely weak in constitutional constraints. So there is no rule of law, as we know, so I'm saying like very obvious things to you. But what is really important, so it manifests itself in the so-called loyalty versus competence dilemma. That is very well known to political economists and comparative politics people. It means that basically, when some things like really badly need to be done, they cannot be done because there are no competent people to do that. Because everybody is afraid of committing mistake. Because people are basically punished for any kind of mistakes or innovation or attempts to kind of, to be a little bit more entrepreneurial than they expected to be. And this is a systematic structural vulnerability of the Russian regime. So the default strategy to survive for the rank and file, be it both in the army or in the economic sector or education sector, so something I witnessed myself, not to do anything until one gets a clear order. Just to show, okay, I was given this order, so this is what I did. But there's also kind of a thing that is called pocket of efficiency, so it's a kind of a way to bypass these limitations, systemic limitations. So the so-called islands of ad hoc regulation patronage. There is plenty of literature on that, so I'm not going to delve on this. So what does it mean for us? So if we extrapolate this logic on Prigozhin's and this PMC, private military companies, situation. So basically, Prigozhin became the so-called a trickster, a risk enabler. It was a perfect combination of basically three factors. his positionality within the Russian elites. That's the first one. The second one, a very special arrangement with GRU, so he was not actually, there were no contractual relations with MOD, Ministry of Defense, and PMC Redut, which is kind of replacing ČVK Wagner at the moment. So it has a pretty different institutional arrangements to kind of tackle this problem that happened to be the case with Wagner. And finally, so this is the access to the media empire, something that Redut doesn't have and not going to have for very obvious reasons. And that also kind of helped gain some personal popularity to Prigozhin. So the combination of these three factors, maybe there are some more. Maybe he also has some kind of, my co-author believes that he also kind of had this entrepreneurial skills. He was a bit special in kind of like in terms of personal qualities. I don't want to praise his personal qualities that much, so I just I dropped this point. But basically, Prigozhin pulled the right strings in an authoritarian system that builds on risk-averse loyalty. So this is a kind of a framework I have in mind. Another point, so this is kind of, I go into the our conclusion. So is there any popular support for figures like Prigozhin? So because it's also kind of, we know this is not a political system when people's opinion matter one way or another, but still, so there were plenty of speculation whether people would like to have a political figure like Prigozhin. So here I basically relied on the Nevada Post and what I really enjoy, the Open Minds Institute. Let me advertise this group a little bit. These are Ukrainian data scientist colleagues who actually are doing very decent research on what's going on, what's happening with to the Russian public opinion. And basically putting all this data together with all the skepticism we have towards opinion polls. So what we see that there is no like widespread support for people like Prigozhin or Strelkov or here / Gerkin. So basically there is also no gender, age, or level of education, federal distance. So these variables actually don't have any significant impact on sentiments towards Prigozhin or people like him. But there is a kind of a hint that there is a limited demand for the wartime populism. So this is a kind of a vague term I introduced for this analysis. So it's not like these people are absolutely kind of missing the point. So they touch the nerve. But for some reason, their popularity does not exceed like this 29%, so perhaps this is the maximum, so we observed so far. Again, with all the disclaimers about reliability of Russian public opinion polls. So, and the last slide. So the main takeaways, so I basically rushed through like a slightly bigger research, but what I really wanted the points I wanted to highlight today is that the Vladimir Putin system is built on risk-averse loyalty, and it needs informal actors such as Prigozhin actually to compensate for the inefficiencies of official actors. So if we recall like education reforms, high school economics or like other endeavors, this is pretty much the same logic. So there's some political entrepreneurs that fill the niche. I hate comparing these areas together, but this is the logic behind. So the elimination of Prigozhin does not resolve the structural weakness, but only shifts the problem elsewhere, so it's not gone. And finally, those private military companies should not be seen as private armies, so this title is very misleading. It's just an extension of the bureaucratic army or attempts to produce pockets of efficiency, so it's still the continuation of the Russian state, but on the cheap. It looks as if it's outsourced, but they become outlaws. So in this case, so it's a very interesting combination. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Margarita, for this fascinating presentation, and I now would like to give the floor to Ilya for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Marlene. And I really enjoyed all 4 papers, and they provided a clear overview of post-war politics. But what I also enjoyed about the papers was that they provided a glimpse around the corner of what a post-Putin world might look like. So I'm going to talk about these papers in reverse order. So I'm going to initially talk about Prigozhin and the paper on Margarita's paper. And I think Prigozhin was a unique figure in Russian politics because he was actually able to criticize the regime, and several of the military powers and individuals who led the war in Ukraine. He was able to criticize the war effort far more than any other Russians. Indeed, any other Russian who would have criticized the war effort to the same degree as Prigozhin would probably have found himself under various sorts of prosecution, including foreign agents and criticizing the war and so forth. So I think Prigozhin was able to get away with all these criticisms because, essentially because he had his own army and the ear of Vladimir Putin. And that should not be underestimated as to why Prigozhin was able to mount such a new and different type of military operation in Russia. But I think going forward, if we can learn anything from Prigozhin, and this gets on to the idea of the regime being risk averse, I think he now represents a cautionary tale if one goes beyond the established system and the demand for loyalty. So I think Prigozhin and his fate really shows the limits of Putin's system and the ability to allow for independent voices going forward. The second article by Marat suggests that at least Kadyrov, in terms of understanding the limits of criticizing the Russian army, basically understood that he couldn't really double down and criticize the army as much as Prigozhin did. He, as the speaker emphasized, he pronounced his loyalty to Putin, but also volunteered Chechen forces in Ukraine. So what I would really want to learn more about Kadyrov and the situation in Chechnya is what is his long-term goals? Does he see himself as a potential successor of Putin, or is he just trying to make sure that he remains in power and basically doesn't befall the fate of his father, who was assassinated in 2004? So I think what is fascinating about Kadyrov is his ambitions, and not only his ambitions, but the ambitions of him for his sons. They have actually been in the news frequently in the past few months, and it leaves the question as to whether Kadyrov's goal is to allow for some sort of succession to his children, like he did for his assassinated father, or whether he really has aspirations for higher power and higher positions in a post-Putin world. Finally, I want to deal with the two papers that deal with Russia's economic future. I think these are most revealing. I was interested in the article about whether Putin and Russia was following Keynesian military economics, because in many ways, I think that gives too much credit to Putin and his economic policy. I think Putin has been improvising since this war, and since he discovered that he wasn't going to be in Kiev in 2 weeks. So I think the question is for Kadyrov and Keynesian economics is Russia has basically tried an improvisation of economics since the failure to get into Kiev in the first 2 weeks. It has also relied on Keynesian and Western economics in the sense that the central bank has now raised interest rates to an exorbitant 15% just to preserve the ruble. And so I think that what is becoming clear is that Russia occasionally turns to Western economics and Western economic principles, but with clear consequences. For example, how can small businesses survive and prosper if the interest rates are at 15% or higher? I'm further skeptical in terms of Putin's economic policy as to whether the annexed regions in Ukraine will be a driver of economic growth. Indeed, I think my understanding is that Russia has gained an increased number of pensioners but not entrepreneurs. And so whether the decision to annex certain parts of Ukraine will provide any economic benefits is an open question. I do recognize that Russia is still selling oil and gas to China and India, respectively, but they are doing so at a significant discount. And in the case of India, they are selling it for rupees, which is not a convertible currency, and therefore has significant problems in terms of Russia's economic future and its ability to trade both with India and with China, since they have provided significant discounts for oil and gas that's going to China. I agree that Europe has taken a hit in terms of its economics, but the big lesson, I think, going forward is that a country should not alienate their best customer, because Russia and Europe were willing to pay hard currency at market rates for Russian oil and gas, and now Russia has to improvise as to how they're going to sell these goods on international markets. Finally, there are several, I think, dark economic clouds on the horizon, especially due to sanctions. And I think sanctions have actually had a bigger hit on the Russian economy than people give it credit. So one of the things that has diminished for the Russian economy is that there is a significant decrease in the money for startups and small and medium-sized businesses. The policy of import substitution means that Russia isn't concerned not only with major matters, but also really minor issues. For example, there was a recent article in the press talking about the need for Russia to increase its supply of national cosmetics because international cosmetics were too expensive, and therefore that Russia needed to spend more money on such policies as cosmetics. There is no money to increase the salaries of teachers and doctors. More importantly, Russia has nationalized several Western companies, and if one was to look forward, I think that the Western companies will all remember this nationalization when after the war is over. There have been reports that Rosnano is going broke, and this was the company that was supposed to lead Russian innovation going forward. There are still disputes as to whether the security services should be allowed to regulate businesses in terms of supervision. And finally, the Ministry of Finance recently declared that it wants to raise the price of vodka, always an ominous sign of any sort of economic development. In conclusion, Peskov has recently said that Russia can live for a decade under sanctions. Unfortunately, Mr. Peskov is not an economist, and I think he is too optimistic as to how Russia can survive in light of all the sanctions that have been imposed. And with that.
Thank you so much for your comments. Thanks to our speaker who really took the time limit very seriously. We have like 50 minutes for the Q&A, which is really great, so we will have time to do 2-3 rounds of questions. So let's begin by collecting 3 questions, and then I want also to give the floor back to the panelists so they can answer William's questions and comments. So let me see, I see lady here first.
Good morning. I'm Amy McCampbell, student here at GW Ilya. I wanted to address a question to the wonderful economic gurus of our panel, Mr. Volodymyr and Peter. I wanted to ask, how do you see the mass casualties experienced by the Russian military and their revised conscription methods affecting the domestic economy in the long term, considering its aging demographics in Russia? Do you think it's something to watch carefully the longer this conflict is drawn out, or do you think the ways in which they're conscripting Cubans and also looking at the Chechens is going to kind of hinder that? So if you would please give me your 2 cents, it would be much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then, yeah. it's coming from the other side. From the
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. I'd kind of like to follow up on some of Will's comments. The inconvenient truths that we need to understand are crucial. There are probably some for Putin as well. And I tend to increasingly think about this war in terms of the Dune trilogy. The Harkonnens spent a lot of money to conquer the planet, and the result was they were broke. Putin has really failed to develop Russia's economy in any way that's going to be sustainable in the future. The population is going to decrease by about 15 to 20% in each subsequent generation for at least the next 2 or 3. They're already short of workers in most sectors. The war is going to make that population increase even more serious, lowering the labor force. The dependency ratio in the future is going to be gargantuan. The number of industrial sectors that he has crippled is growing every week. He started import substitution in 2013 in response to the Magnitsky Act. At the end of 2022, Russian companies, business associations put out data indicating that the Russian economy still depended as much on imports as it had a decade earlier. And the sector of the economy that is most dependent on imports is oil and gas. Russia's LNG exporters have already cut their expectation for what they'll be able to produce by the end of this decade in half. Rosneft has lost its production capacity in several places. The budget after 2024 looks really bleak. I could go on and on, but I will stop. Does Putin, if you want me to repeat the question, does Putin need to think about the inconvenient truths for Russia long term?
Thank you. And then in the back, yes, and then we will come back for a second one. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kendall. I'm with the Department of Energy. My question is for Peter. And really, the overarching question is how to coordinate the most effective action against the energy sector. But under that, I heard a few questions about gas. A mysterious anchor dropped on a few gas pipelines between the Baltics and the rest of Europe. Norway is the major producer of gas for Europe. So Russia, I think, perhaps is launching a type of hybrid economic warfare against the European gas supplies. How does the Western Bloc coordinate the most effective action against the Russian gas sector?
Thank you so much. So a lot of great questions. I propose to begin with Peter and Volodymyr and the team first, and then move to the other group, and also feel free after to answer to some of William's comments.
Okay, am I on? Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen with Russian hybrid warfare against Western gas lines or against internet cables. I think that's one of the red lines that we haven't crossed yet, but it's possible they would be interested in crossing it. To Holly's question, and also relates to Bill's comments about, yes, in the long run, Russia's in deep trouble. But in the short run, medium term, talking 5-10 years, I don't see the whole thing falling apart at the seams. And demographic decline, this has been a problem for many countries, and they have that pool of 50 million surplus workers in Central Asia, that most of them speaking Russian, that are only a train ride away, so they can turn the tap on, turn the tap off, and replenish their, please don't interrupt, they can replenish their labor force. That is the North Koreans and the Chinese, if they want to take the Chinese into the Far East. So I don't see that as crippling. Yes, the cost, the question about the casualties, that is a huge problem, the human cost, and also all the injured and amputees and so on. So that is going to drain them. The cost of the occupied territories, yes, that's a huge cost. And in the long run, we're talking about, deep long run, that's what brings down all the empires, right? That they just waste money trying to hold on to possessions which are not generating any revenue. So in the long run, I'm incredibly optimistic that the Russian imperial project will fail. The question is, how do we get to that long run quickly? That's not a completely nonsensical comment. On the startups, yes, this militarization of the economy and the political repression has killed off entrepreneurship. And in my paper, PONARS memo, I looked up the startup index for unicorns, companies with more than $1 billion of assets. There are 400 in about 1,500 worldwide, 400 of them in China, 86 of them in India, 2 or 3 in Brazil, 0 in Russia, although 27 Russian emigres are on that list of having startups. So I absolutely agree, in the long run, this model is a disastrous model for Russia, not to mention its neighbors. But I don't see the ship of state falling apart in the immediate future.
Volodymyr, and then Ilya, Oleg, also feel free to go ahead.
I think several questions were basically about the labor shortage. I'll just say that there are ways to solve this problem. So, for example, inviting immigrant labor to Russia, and then also inviting teenage labor, starting from 14 years old, which is legal. And also prisoner labor, which is also one of the Soviet legacies, could be revived. Whether it's gonna work in a mid-term or long-term, that's of course a big question, and it's a very interesting question to study. But it's not that the situation without no solutions. Plus, some of the production could actually outsource to Iran, producing drones, to North Korea, producing shells. So, yeah, there are ways to. But basically, it's a question of who could be in a worse situation, the West or Russia, sooner, right? And also an interesting question from William about improvising or strategic policies. Obviously, there have been a lot of improvising in the in response to unexpected outcome of the initial invasion plan. However, I would also recall that that Putin's economic team projected much worse economic outcomes before the invasion. They were actually consulted, and they projected up to 30% of GDP decline in 2022. So it doesn't really prove that Putin was not thinking about some severe economic consequences of his move on February 24th.
I think Ilya will answer the most of economic questions. I just wanted to continue what Volodya just said in response to what William said. I think that even if Putin improvises, what he learned from the USSR collapse is that you have to have a strategic macroeconomic policy to survive under the conditions of intense geopolitical conflict. So, the really interesting question is to what extent this turn to Keynesianism is a part of the strategy. So, this option. And so this is what we don't know exactly, and this is interesting to study next.
So I would just add that I have no doubt that the future of the Russian economy is bleak. So there can be no arguments about that. But I think that we should be realistic in terms of assessing the skill of Russia's economic managers and the actual potential of the Russian economy to sustain what's going on. Demographic problems are certainly they're there, but in the horizon of 10 years, for instance, this is not going to be catastrophic, as Peter said. And in terms of import substitution, for instance, kind of basic statistics demonstrates that it wasn't really working for the last 10 years or so, but if one digs deeper, then we see that in the oil and gas industry, domestic investment was like growing by 20% each year,
And in fact, there was some import substitution achieved in terms of equipment, machinery used in the oil and gas sector. And this is why the production has not collapsed. And it doesn't look like there's going to be a huge crisis in the production of oil and gas. So improvisation, I think that actually most governments are improvising. It's not like there's a government that implements a very consistent economic strategy across many years and decades. The question is improvising along which lines? And the improvisation in Russia is along the Keynesian lines. And I think that if we look carefully at the documents prepared by the Ministry of Finance, we see a kind of a hidden Keynesian turn around COVID, I would say. So it began 3 years ago. And back then, they already articulated this vision for a very expansionary fiscal policy and deficit spending in order to stimulate the economy, and then they adopted this kind of policy to the war conditions. And so it is certainly improvisation, but along the lines that we developed earlier, and with a lot of thinking applied to it. It's it's just the truth that if we look at the documents themselves, the arguments are very sophisticated in terms of how this fiscal stimulus is supposed to work. So just my general comment is that we should not underestimate what's going on in Russia just because we need realistic view of what's going on.
Thank you. Marat and Margarita.
Thank you very much, William, for your excellent comments and questions. So I have good news and bad news. Kadyrov health improved, so what's after the question can be postponed a little bit for a while, and depending on your political position, you can put it into good news or bad news. So, however, about his ambitions and long-term political career, I think he realizes that his capacity and that he probably cannot be next Russian president, or maybe after next. And again, depending on your political position, you can put it into either side. That would be an interesting scenario, though. It would be interesting, not good scenario for the world, but it would be interesting. And I think it would be a very teaching scenario, because the West should have paid more attention to Chechnya back then, so it wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't discuss this probability today. When his health was under question, his life was under question, like not long ago, he definitely was promoting his children to some governmental positions within Chechnya, and I think by doing that, probably for him, he was not trying to ensure the succession, as is quite common for authoritarian governments in post-Soviet states, so we have several of such dynasties there, so it wouldn't be surprised. But knowing the political climate and that understanding that his children are still teenagers, he probably was trying just to ensure that they will survive in this political climate for a while at least. So that was probably his ambition. And yeah, of course he wants to remain in power, that's for sure, that's obvious. And is he aspire to get some position within the Russian Federation? It's questionable, because we could think so from his comments on Telegram that we analyzed, but on the other hand, it's always better to be a Tsar of small territory than to a servant of the bigger one. So I think that he probably will remain a Tsar of Chechnya for a while. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the comments. I'll try to be brief. I agree that the mutiny showed the limits of what is actually how the regime can be criticized. But I also would like to kind of emphasize that Prigozhin is not like kind of, a person with superpowers. First of all, he's not, I mean, as long as other research suggests, so he wasn't super, efficient when it comes to economic assets. He was basically capitalizing on economic supplies coming from the state directly. It's not like this is the assets he earned himself. So that's one thing. He was always, despite of having his own army, it's not like really his own army, right? Because, I mean, it wasn't possible to sustain the whole business, military business, without having constant supply from the state. In this sense, again, it's just a continuation of the Russian army. And he did not criticize Putin personally. He actually started attacking MOD first and then Shoigu. It's still a little bit unclear when the whole feud started. But basically, it's something that actually Putin did not expect to come. And this was like, you know, the black swan, if I come this way. So it was kind of a bad surprise due to, again, to the constellation of factors outlined in my presentation. So basically, and finally, when it comes to the medium part, we also don't have to overestimate his kind of managerial talents, because basically, as far as media scholars claim, the troll farm hasn't been operating that well without his kind of direct control. So in this sense, again, so this seems to be working, but we also kind of, you know, tend to kind of exaggerate the success or the economic success of all these enterprises. In this sense, I would say that yes, he did show the limits of the regime, but it also, again, so he was actually way weaker as we actually were used to think about him.
Thank you so much. Let's take a second round of question here.
Thank you very much, Karina Kristelina, Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, George Mason. Two very short, but probably not easy questions. One, war completely moved public opinion in Ukraine toward identification with Europe, support for NATO. How Russia deal with it? Will it accept it, or despite the whole mass misinformation campaigns, how it will deal with this idea that it lost this part of Ukraine in terms of politically and identity? And second question, we know there is some back channeling in this war. Do you see any way how Russia trying to exit the war?
Thank you. Yes, here, and then Eric.
Anders Rutland, a few more points on the sanctions, and I largely agree with what Peter and Will said together, so to say, but 3 points on it. First, the Russian economy has not grown since 2014, and that's when the financial sanctions really started. So they do work. And I think, Peter, you said that you agree with me, that it's no future. The big weakness, which you did not mention, that's a capital flight. You mentioned the capital flight, but it was massive last year. Well, it's normally about $40 billion a year. Last year it was $240 billion. And so the whole current account surplus went out. And this has led to two currency crises, one immediately after the war started, and then one in July, August this year. So I think that this is what we should look for if we think that something can happen all of a sudden. Capital flight plus the weakness of the ruble, which is then, as you pointed out, reflected in the very high interest rate. So this is where I see the weak point of the Russian economy. Otherwise, I completely agree with the whole picture you have given. The Russian economy is not about to collapse otherwise, but it's about to be stagnant and not develop technologically. Thank you.
And here, Eric.
Eric Lohr from American University. I just wanted to follow up on the Keynesian notion, because what I remember from 30 years ago, and Econ 101 was that the Keynesian model is based on large deficit spending, and it's striking to me that the deficit spending is about 0.8% of GDP last year. They're planning on a balanced budget next year. It doesn't sound super Keynesian to me, and I know there are a lot of constraints on raising capital, either domestically or abroad, of course, huge. And in fact, that is a huge constraint on Russia's ability to really ramp up its mobilization and spending on the war effort itself. So kind of follow up on that debate over whether the short term looks good or not, et cetera.
Thank you. And then we have Sofiane there.
Sofiane Zhomachov, George Washington University. I understand that the presentations were prepared in advance, but I was wondering if the upcoming presidential elections in March will play any role in economic, political, or security issues that you mentioned during the presentations. Thank you.
I give you the floor back. Maybe we begin by Marat and Margarita, and then we move back to economics.
Oh, I don't think that there was any question that was directed to me, so.
Margarita.
As long as we discuss public opinion, so I believe that this is my topic. The question on how Russian residents perceived that they lost part of Ukraine. First of all, they don't think that they lost it. I think that's the key point. So I mean, as long as we can trust, to the extent we can trust all the data coming from Russia. So I think that's not the common point. So we're not there yet. So when the war is over, hopefully, where there will be some kind of a change of the situation. So we'll see how it's going to change. But at the moment, so there is nothing to discuss in this sense. Well, when it comes to how Russia exits the war, so this is like one these questions. I wish I knew the answer. But if I may speculate a little bit here, so again, following up on the public opinion and propaganda stuff. So I believe, based on the research we've done so far, that Russian propaganda machine is kind of technically skillful enough to package any solution in the way to the benefit, to the Kremlin's benefit. In this sense, so the way I read the situation, what's going on at the moment, so the government is basically testing the waters without losing its kind of public face. I mean, to the extent actually didn't lose it yet, right? So this is my reading of the situation. So, and finally, when the question on the elections in March and whether it's going to have any impact on economics, my speculations, but then I will kind of, make a pass to the economics team. So I don't think so, because I think the classical clientelism, patronage elections, so all these things are in the past already, like in past in the 90s. And what's going on now in Russia, so these are control elections, workplace mobilizations and things like that. These are sticks, not carrots. So, and I wouldn't actually expect any kind of, large-scale state public programs trying to stimulate people go to the polls, because they already learned how to do it cheaper, and I would say with a more certain result. That's it from me.
Thank you. And now back to Peter and Volodymyr.
Yeah. I also comment on the question about Ukraine. It's actually pretty interesting that the discussion about the methodological discussion about the Ukrainian service is much less developed than the methodological discussion about to which extent we can rely on this service in Russia, although the problems with the preference falsification, even bigger problems with the dislocation of the population, the part of the population staying in the occupied areas, and millions outside of Ukraine, and the millions are dislocated within Ukraine, and so to which extent we can reliably measure the public opinion within Ukraine is a question that requires a lot of, at least much more methodological reflection right now than I'm noticing here. So all the questions, for example, to which extent the people who reply that yes, Ukraine should join NATO, Ukraine should join the EU, we are patriots of Ukraine, the series of questions which are related to that, they could be questioned to the same extent that the meanings in responses to these questions among the diverse Ukrainian citizens could be quite different. And the different citizens in Ukraine may support joining NATO for quite different reasons. Some could be more ideologically driven, it's like civilizational choice. For others, this could be simply a pragmatic choice against Russia. And that brings the question to which extent this consolidation is actually sustainable, stable, or it could be quite fragile in response to quite, possibly not really victorious developments at the front line. And in the most recent waves of service in Ukraine, we see that there is some cracks in that stability in response to the failure of Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so, and also, that's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that I also agree with Margarita that I'm not sure that the Russian society perceives it in that way. I'm not even sure that Russian elite perceives it in that way, that they actually lost the elite, that part of Ukraine, because the discussion among the Russian elites, Russian intellectuals, is actually, we didn't even need that Western Ukraine, they're a problem for us, basically. They're not the same people like us, but they're different. And if you see, for okay, Karaganov was already mentioned. He doesn't want to take Western Ukraine.
About how Russia will exit the war, so this is connected to for how much time Russia can continue the war. And like that is why we are conducting this research, because Margarita rightly claims that there is a very limited demand inside Russia for, let's say, Prigozhinism, or enthusiastic support of the war. So that is why we study economic measures which can produce social groups who will passively, or as Volodymyr put it, rationally support the war without like big enthusiasm. So, and that is why we even if military Keynesianism cannot lead to economic growth, so the question is for how much time it can influence the society to produce social groups that will basically and rationally support the continuation of the war.
So I will quickly answer the specific question on Keynesianism. So 2% deficit is large by Russian standards. So you wouldn't normally count as a very expansionary fiscal policy, but Russian Ministry of Finance's approach has always been very conservative. And so for them, it's like a spending spree, 2% of the GDP. And they do plan to make the deficit even smaller next year. But if we look carefully at these documents produced by the Ministry of Finance, I don't think it's possible. I don't think that they will be able to maintain this absolutely dramatic increase in military spending, which is like more than 100. So it's 6% of the GDP, and this is not all. This is only spending on the Ministry of Defense. So the total military spending, if we count everything, will be closer to like 10% of the GDP. So to have this kind of spending without a significant deficit, I don't think it's possible. So this plan is a bit obfuscating the real situation. So I think they will continue with this policy of having 2%, 3% deficit in the next few years. So this is kind of Keynesianism for the Russian Ministry of Finance, maybe not for other ministries around the world.
Yeah, continuing the Keynesian theme, I think the big expansion is in the credit sphere, which I didn't have much time to get into in the memo, but we're talking about 12 trillion rubles, over $100 billion in credits to business, then 300 billion rubles or so to private households. So they really lost control of the monetary policy. So that's where the tough decisions are going to have to be made. On the military spending, I think Julian Cooper has a paper coming out on this, and I don't want to put words into his mouth, but I think he does think that 6% is accurate, including all the various branches of the security complex. And as Aslan's question of the capital flight, yes, and they've been taking measures to try and tackle this, right? So they've reintroduced the compulsory exchange of dollars for rubles for 43 leading exporters on a list that's not being published, but they've promised to crack down on daughter companies, offshore subsidiaries of those exporters to ensure that try and close the leaks in the flow of export revenues, and as I mentioned, the export tariff on non-oil and gas products. That's the 43 companies, so the non-oil and gas export tariffs to capture some of the rents from the weaker ruble, meaning export revenues more valuable. So they are taking steps to do this, and some oligarchs have complained, like Mordashov, the iron and steel magnate, complained, this is going to choke off investments, it's bad for economic development, so there is a kind of policy debate going on. But as Ilya said, it is kind of fairly rational and pragmatic, it seems. A couple of points. I didn't address Bill's question about the Indian counter trade and all of those rupees. Russia's accumulating over $1 billion a month of rupees that they can't find products to spend on. It reminds me, I interviewed an Indian businessman back in the 1990s who was in charge of counter trade. Like, you need to sell a lot of plastic flip-flops and tea to buy big jets. So this is not a new problem, because the Indian economy has changed a lot, and now they have a lot more valuable stuff to offer Russia than flip-flops and tea. So we'll see how the Indian policy evolves. They have been very pro-Russia. Frankly, the government position has been very sympathetic to Russia over the Ukraine war, which is a great pity. Maybe the Hamas war will turn things around, because India is kind of pro-Israel in that one. So we'll see what happens there. Interesting to watch. And I do have a question for Margarita. I found her analysis very, very persuasive of this risk-averse loyalist bureaucracy. So how can that picture be reconciled with Putin's incredibly risky invasion of Ukraine, February 24th? So what's the answer to that puzzle?
So if I may. Well, actually, I think this kind of a bad governance framework is quite suitable to explain that, because this loyalty versus competence dilemma this is what actually is going to happen to a regime when there is like very little competent bureaucrats or analysts who would be able to reach to the decision makers and basically do the proper analysis. So this is basically how my colleagues call it pernicious decision, was largely a result of, I wouldn't say like miscalculus or being irrational. It's basically a result of lack of skill, first of all, and then second, so since it's a personal dictatorship, so there is plenty of research analysis done, I'm going to cover it right now, about like Putin's personal stance on Ukraine. So it's his personal war, basically. And I think Marlene knows much more about that, and sure, like does stuff on this.
Thank you. We now have time for one more round of questions, and I see plenty here. So Masha, one here, and then we'll move on that side.
Hi, Mary Lippman, Russia Post, Iris. Actually, the question is a follow-up question to Margarita and whoever else wants to add to that. How do you reconcile risk-averse loyalty with improvisation? Is it a matter of the level of government management? Up to a certain level, they're only allowed to be loyal, and then they're allowed to improvise. And of course, I fully agree with what Ilya said, that improvisation is hardly a flaw or a weakness. So this applies not only to government management as we usually understand them, but also governors, who are usually seen as par excellence people who are risk averse out of loyalty. But if we look at today's situation, different governors find themselves in very difficult circumstances. Belgrade governor would be one example, a person who has to improvise a lot, and for whom risk-averse loyalty certainly is not enough. Just one example. Thank you.
Something in the back there.
Thank you, Sam Green from CBAN Kings. A question for the panel as a whole. It's been said a few times this morning, both on this panel and the previous one, that we don't really have a clear vision for what Russia looks like after the war, and that's certainly true. It strikes me that Putin himself has probably purposefully also not projected a clear vision for what Russia looks like after the war. And I'm wondering, since you're coming at this from different perspectives, the social one, bureaucratic, managerial, in the economy, how much do you see that as a problem for the system going forward, and how long do you think he can sustain that open-ended sort of balancing act?
Hello, Jacob Levitan, Johns Hopkins SAIS. So I have a question on the Russian economy, specifically on how you see what isn't being spent on the special military operation, the war, on regional projects, on particularly Siberia. There's a lot of talk about the development of the Northern Sea route, the Arctic, but I haven't really seen a lot on securing Siberia, on reassuring Siberia. I've seen provocations about nuclear testing in empty Siberia, but when I was there, a lot of fear on encroachment from China, and I'm wondering, first, rather than just prestige projects like the Vostochny Cosmodrome, do you see actual real investment in developing the region?
And the last question will be two rounds, two rows below. Yes, there.
So just maybe a narrow question for Steve Kiley at Rutland College. So going back to this question about Keynesianism, so maybe it's small military Keynesianism, but to follow on Sam's question, what happens after the war? So you're saying that there's been a lot of spending here, and some of it's actually gained some regime legitimacy. There's a lot of social spending and so forth, so benefits. Is that something that can contain indefinitely, a varying time frame of 5 to 10 years? Is that even after the war, is there still military Keynesianism?
Thank you. With that, I give you the floor back. Maybe we begin also with Margarita, and we move back to here, and William will also comment. Margarita.
Thank you so much for fantastic questions. Improvisation and risk aversion, how they actually can be put together. So to me it sounds pretty logical, because if the whole system is over-regulated, over the Russian bureaucracy and state, basically, again, as I said, default option is not to do anything until everything, the instructions are clear and we're playing safe. If you need to improvise, usually it's in the situation, so because I've been studying Russian municipalities for a while, and basically the idea is that when municipal bureaucrats improvise is when they are under pressure from below, when their constituency come to them and says, like, please do something because, well, we need this thing to be done right now. If it's not done, so you're going to face consequences. So this kind of bottom-up accountability forces them to improvise in different ways. So, and some of these ways are quite often can be seen as corruption, because they need to kind of deviate from the spending side, public spending cycle in such a way, and it's very easy to do, honestly speaking, to violate Russian, public procurement law. So that they basically are always kind of, balancing, they walk on the thin ice when it comes to this thing. So this is a very kind of low-risk example I brought here. When it comes to situations that are way more important, like in high risk, so for me, I'm even surprised why Belgrade governors and bureaucrats are so passive given the situation, because they basically are just expected to face some bottom-up pressure, but it seems that it's not happening at the moment, and I'm a bit puzzled by that. So, yeah, so I would expect more proactivity, but this is not happening. And how it's possible, so basically when you can improvise, these are the you would like to improvise safely. This is why the Russian state has been providing this kind of, has been allocating special areas of privileged operation when, political bureaucrats or political entrepreneurs were operating safely, knowing that they're not going to face this kind of over-regulated proverka and all kinds of stuff. So this was kind of an informal rule under which like certain policies were being implemented. So this is how I think improvisation and risk aversions are coexisting. So there is no paradox to me here.
I will talk a little bit briefly about what's after war. Predictions are not a good thing, as was mentioned before here, but the question is here, and it all depends on how war ends, right? So which party will win, what will be the deal about how to end the war. And on the one hand, it can help to break out completely, including the whole destabilization of the North Caucasus, which is not very stable, as you could probably observe like yesterday in Dagestan. And in addition to that, there are grievances, I believe, among the indigenous people of Siberia as well, so it all can just spill out. And in this sense, Putin's regime is in a very unstable background. Whereas on the other hand, whatever scenario would be of the end of the war, it can bring on top of the Russian Federation even harsher dictator. And in this sense, it will be even more confrontation with the West. So sustainability of Russia in this sense, probably economic team will answer better how sustainable Russia is. But repeating some of the also thoughts that was expressed before, I can certify that sanctions really work. Kadyrov is complaining a lot about them, so they really work. So there is a chance that the economic pressure of the West can give some kind of results. Thank you.
So, short remark on sustainability. The interesting thing about the oil price cap is that it is designed not only to ensure a break-even price for Russian oil, but also to ensure some profit. So in terms of sanctions, this is a rather interesting one, because it allows Russia to trade, to sell oil with a profit. And if you combine these with an acceptable 2%, 3% GDP deficit, then it looks quite sustainable in the long run. And even after the war, the army will need to be rebuilt, so all these supplies of fighter jets and tanks will need to be restocked. So this thing can go on for a long time. I mean, if we're realistic about it, it's not going to be great for Russian citizens. So stagnant incomes, which are very low at the moment. So Russian incomes are like median income is less than $500, something like that. So it's very difficult to live in such conditions, but it is a kind of survival minimum. And this combination of survival and constant investment in the military, in international defense and so on, so this is possible to sustain for a long time. And I think we need to grapple with this fact that yes, the economic future for Russia is bleak, but the situation can be prolonged for many decades to come. And this is also a response to this interesting question about the image of the future. So I completely agree that Putin doesn't want to provide any image of the future, but somehow he counts on this idea that this eternal present will suffice. So people who benefit from the war, they will continue to benefit from the war. So people who oppose the war, they do not matter because they're repressed. And so I think the logic here is that this situation can go on forever. And I'm sure that it's not true in reality. But still, there are a lot of pessimistic things that indicate that it can go on for a long time, the present.
It is interesting like that. It is very similar to what Ilya just said about economy. So how the social support for the war is organized. Because yes, so on the one hand, the fact that Putin does not provide people with a long-term perspective is problematic. So people don't believe in Putinism as a project. But at the same time, it means that people don't expect much. That they expect some short-term or situational things from Putin. And this is like what we revealed with Volodya when we started analyzing public sociology laboratory, our in-depth interviews with Russians, like so ordinary Russians who declared they supported special military operations, they didn't share any long-term imperialistic worldview about Ukraine or the world with Putin. But it's precisely this led to the fact that people thought like this, like, okay, we even don't like these people in the Kremlin, we don't share any values with them, but because of this, we believe that they have some special knowledge about for what reason to start the war. Or we just finished 8 focus groups in 4 Russian cities. So, and we asked people about Putin, and again, so people don't see any long-term future perspective from the side of the government, but they really want the special military operation to finish as soon as possible. And so that is why they support Putin. So because I mean, almost everyone in 4 cities, and 8 focus groups, like only such a great politician as Putin can finish special military operation. So this is his mission. So that is why we will vote with him in the next election.
A little bit divergent voice to the question about the long-term vision. I wanted to point to that some of the elements of the new reality that emerged after the invasion, they're becoming ideologized by the Russian political elite. So, for example, import substitution. We lost Western companies, but we are developing Russian economy. Then so-called nationalization of the elites. We lost some compradors who left Russia, but this is great, and we are now like consolidated patriots. This may contribute to some of the vision which may indeed didn't exist on the eve of the invasion, on the start of the invasion, but the objective requirements of mobilizing the nation may produce some of the demand for such long-term vision, which may be weak now, but may develop in the course of the war. And this also connects to the question about what happens with Keynesianism after the war. And this is indeed a concern that is raised by some of the analysts. What's going to happen with this heavily militarized economy, and the war is over? It obviously depends on how exactly the war is over. If, for example, we would project the end of the Second World War and what happened with the United States economy, which was militarized during the Second World War, but then the Cold War started, and it helped to sustain the post-war boom. And so, if we are going to end the war in Ukraine in a way of kind of like redux of the Cold War, that may again sustain this kind of economy for some considerable future.
Well, on the vision question, I think Putin's strategy to de-Europeanize Russia will succeed, unfortunately. But I don't see Russia developing this close partnership with China. There's too much fear of China's power. So I see it more on a north-south than east-west axis. So the closest partnerships are with Iran, with Syria, with Turkey, with the Gulf states, very close partnership with Saudi Arabia, not only cooperating in OPEC Plus to jack up the price of oil, but the Saudis buying Russian crude and using it to generate electricity. The Chinese have been dragging their feet on the second natural gas export pipeline, presumably pushing for a very tough price. The Siberia question fits into this. You know, Siberia has been starved of investment. There's massive hydropower resources they could have been developing in Siberia and then building transmission lines to export electricity to China. That's not happening. The investment dollars are going into Rosatom, European-based power stations. So in that kind of broader geopolitical context, I see this drive to the south.
Yeah, I just want to say a few words about the future economy and how the war ends. I often turn to the economist Herbert Stein, who said, if something can't last forever, it won't. And therefore, I think that is really the basic prospect for the Russian economy, that it just can't take all these hits and keep surviving. In terms of how Russia exits the war, I feel that indeed the war will end long before Russia actually ends the war. And that is because Russia will be a permanent defendant in many international tribunals going forward. The Europeans are basically rewriting the law on crimes of aggression and crimes against peace, and they are very active in trying to prosecute that for going forward. I think the Ukrainians have over 100,000 cases that they want to deal with. What jurisdiction, what law they deal with this is unclear, but that's what they want to do as well. And finally, there is the legal quandary of reparations, because there is a growing demand that Russia pay for any sort of recovery in Ukraine with the 300 billion assets that are in European banks and other places abroad. So I think that the war really doesn't end when the hostilities end, but will continue to radiate and become basically a albatross around Russia, because I don't see Russia getting a free pass to European institutions and free trade agreements at the end of this war. I think that this will be a long recovery for Russia.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to conclude. It was a wonderful panel, so thank you very much.